The village was called Moglaya. The map no longer knew her, just as it did not know hundreds of other such points, places where people once drank on a bench, planted cabbages and cursed at young people. Now there were half-rotted huts. There were no windows in the blackened walls, only holes filled with plywood or carpet. Some houses still smelled of smoke, and somewhere under the floor there could still be dead people who had not waited for either salvation or the end. Ilya lived in the old post office, a concrete box with grills, a generator and an iron door, which he removed from a military kung. He was stubborn, dry, with gray temples and black stubble. He used to be an engineer, but now he's more of a wolf. Soldering iron in one hand, sawn, off shotgun in the other. He spoke little, and when he spoke slowly, and without emotion. He had an old transceiver, which would have cost a whole box of stew if there were still those who make stew. He couldn't remember exactly how it started anymore. It seems that the news went about the outbreak in South Asia, then in Italy. Then there was no difference. People began to die quickly, then slowly, then not to die at all, just to disappear. By the spring of the first year, the dead were in every basement. Every fifth tried to shoot back, and every second tried to burn someone. There were still those who knew how to dig, how to keep quiet, and how to leave without waiting for an explanation. A woman came to the village, a broken backpack, a sawn, off shotgun wrapped in a rag on his shoulder. His hair was cropped short, and he looked like a dog that had been beaten with an iron chain. Her name was Sveta, and Ilya did not immediately realize that she was not alone. A boy of about 8 years old was holding onto her like a wall. He didn't talk, he didn't whine, he just stared. She didn't ask for it. She exchanged the canned food for the night in the hallway. Then she stayed. A week later, a third appeared. Teenager, about 15 years old, in a tunic with a hole in the sleeve. His face was thin and pale, as if made of clay. He didn't give his name. He had a knife and an old flask. He ate slowly, always leaving some behind, as if for tomorrow. He lived in a barn. Sveta was afraid of him. Ilya respected him. The guy didn't ask, didn't touch, just survived. That's how the band was formed. No one talked about it, but everyone understood that they would not last alone. The dogs were getting angrier. The cold came from the marshes, and the wind carried the smell of rot from an abandoned farm. Sometimes there was a fire on the horizon, which meant that someone else was alive, or dying. There was no order. There were no laws. The words state and future were missing. All that's left are canned food, fragments of a former life, and fear. The fear that sooner or later they will come. Not them, but some others. Without words, without needs, just out of habit to destroy. Sveta suggested clearing the old school. The roof was still standing there, and it was possible to assemble the batteries. Ilya gave her a crowbar. He stayed and worked on the battery, from which someone drained the electrolyte and peed inside. Sveta's boy was sick, fever, cramps. Sveta made amulets for him out of bags, put batteries under his head, as if it made it easier. No one told her not to. One evening they sat around a campfire, without words. We were just eating. An old satellite buzzed in the sky behind him, a rarity. Ilya looked at him and said, "Everything dead glows." No one else said a word. And that evening, for the first time, they realized that true silence is not the absence of sounds. This is when no one else wants to say anything, because everything has already been said, everything has already burned down, and everything is still just beginning. The ground here was like a curse, heavy, wet, as if it had been lying under it forever. The shovel went with a crunch, as if it was freezing into someone's rotting flesh. Sveta was digging under the garden, wincing at the pain in her back. Not for myself, but for my son. He hardly got up. His eyes were dull, and his lips were blue. No one knew what was wrong with him. Maybe it's a cold. Maybe it was something else, but there was no one to figure it out. The disease didn't ask for permission here. It just came and ate from the inside. Ilya was twisting the wires at that time. He managed to assemble an LED spotlight, which he hung at the entrance to the old school. The light in the night was like a challenge, like a warning light, and it was stupid. But Ilya is tired of living like a shadow. He wanted to remind himself for a moment what electricity looked like. Dima, the teenager, brought a bag of fish. No one asked where he had exchanged it or stolen it. He had his own view of survival. The less you talk, the longer you live. He appeared like a ghost and disappeared the same way. Scarred, bruised, but with loot. Once he brought an old flask with the inscription, Pharma. There was liquid inside, which suffocated the rats. Pashka appeared. Pashka the chemist lived on the other side of the village, in the building of an old boarding school. They called him the chemist because he was chasing something in the basement, from alcohol to pills that made him sick. He was a pharmacist in the past, no one now. He had steel teeth and a grin. He sold pills for kerosene and vodka, never took food, always asked for bullets. He said he was getting ready. He didn't specify why. Ilya did not communicate with him, but he knew that if someone died from the medicine, it would be his doing. Sveta went to him, and on her knees asked for antipyretics for her son. Pashka gave her a bag of powder and said, "If he dies, call him. I'll open it. Let's see how it works." Ilya wanted to kill him that evening, but restrained himself. On the fourth day the signal cracked on the air, right in the middle of the night. A voice flashed in the old transistor that Ilya kept in the bedroom. Hoarse, even. Zone 6. The sector has been cleared. The perimeter is set. The objects are under control. Time has passed. Ilya was sitting in front of the radio like a damn thing. Time passed, which meant that someone, somewhere, had turned on the system. Protocols that worked when everything was still alive. Nothing was alive now. This is not salvation. This is a sweep. The signal disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. The next morning they gathered at school. Sveta was angry. Her eyes were burning. Dima stood in the shadows as if he wasn't with them. Ilya was silent. "There's someone alive there," Sveta said. "Someone is speaking according to protocol. This means that there is a structure. Where there is structure, there are remnants of power. We need to get to them." "And ask to be finished off?" Ilya replied softly. Pashka appeared later. Drunk, dirty, with a bandage around his neck. "There are no authorities there. There are no people there. There's a car. She's just counting. Those who breathe must be extinguished so that everything is clean again. Do you think they'll treat your kid? They'll dismember him to figure out why he's still breathing." Sveta spat to the side and went out. 2 people came into the village that night. At first they thought it was dogs. Then they heard footsteps, slow, unhurried. One of them was in uniform without shoulder straps. The second one has bandaged hands. They walked towards the school without hiding. They had one lantern and a long armature instead of a gun. Ilya turned on the light. They stopped and watched. One of them smiled. "It's fine here. Heat. Quietly. You can live." Ilya was standing with a gun. Sveta, with a knife. Dima was somewhere upstairs. "No," Ilya said. "You can't. They're gone. Just like that. Without threats. Without words." But half an hour later, the school caught fire. The annex was set on fire. In the morning, they found a goat carcass, butchered and nailed to the door. The words, "Dirt should not glow," are written in charcoal on the skin. Ilya realized that the signal was real, but not salvation. And the countdown. And time passed. Dima was found on the 3rd day, in an old pumping station outside the village. He was lying on the concrete, wrapped in a torn tarpaulin cape, under which rats were moving. His mouth was torn, his fingers were crushed, and the letters "carrier" were burned into his chest. He didn't speak, and he hasn't spoken since. Ilya brought it on his back. The boy didn't moan, just stared at the ceiling. "Nothing in my eyes. Like a drowned man." Sveta hugged him to her, roared silently into his face, as if she could breathe life into him. Nothing worked. No bandages. No compresses. Pashka gave her some drops. They smelled of acetone and mint. "She'll eat him up in a week," he said, not looking at her. It's either you or it. Choose one. The village was restless at night. The wind was dragging the film across the ground, and somewhere in the forest an animal was howling, not a dog or a wolf. Something in between. The old wire fences were shaking as if from footsteps. No one came out. Since Dima was found, something has cracked in people, as if they finally realized that it was getting worse. No one believes anymore that they'll just sit it out. Sveta tried to assemble a gathering. People didn't come. She, Ilya, and Pashka remained. His eyes were cloudy, and there was gray foam on his lips. He slept 2 hours a day. The rest of the time he ate pills and evaporated some powders. The basement of the school smelled of chemicals and blood. You'd better sleep, Ilya told him. We won't survive anyway. Why should you get on your nerves? I don't want to survive, Pashka snapped. I want to be the last to die. The next day, Sveta's boy disappeared. He just disappeared. No note, no trace. Sveta tore off her nails, running through the ruins. She screamed into the swamp like cotton wool. He returned by himself, in the evening. Dirty, with a dead sparrow in his hands. He didn't eat it. He just held it. There was no fear or pain on his face. Just something as deep as the bottom. The stranger came that night, without a sound, as if cut out of thin air. He was tall, wiry, and wore an unmarked jumpsuit. Around his neck is a badge. MTK, Squad 22. He couldn't speak or didn't want to. Sveta pointed a gun at him, but he didn't move. I just put a bag of canned food and a first aid kit on the doorstep. Then he sat down against the wall and fell asleep. Then Pashka said, He's not with us. He's one of the ones who stayed. Someone who knows how to turn off the lights. Keep an eye on him. He eats like scum and is silent like death. Ilya turned on the radio. There was a rustle on Purity 441.2, then a voice. Confirmed. Vector 9, Sector 6. Rehabilitation continues. The objects are considered dangerous. Admission is prohibited. The control is automatic. Ilya pulled out the wire. That's it. They won't come. They're watching. They just watch until we finish each other off. Sveta was silent. The boy was sleeping by her side, clutching a dead sparrow. Pashka disappeared. No one went to his basement. Only screeching could be heard from there at night. It was as if someone had been stabbed there, or something. Everything in the village is quiet, even the rats, even the wind. Everyone knew that we were below the bottom. No escape, no punishment, just slow rot. The world is not dead. He had swallowed himself and now lay digesting. The water came out of the ground, as if someone was pressing it with their hands from below. At first, in Pashka's basement, the smell of mold was replaced by rotten organic matter. The air became heavier, as if it had been driven through a wet cloth. Then the water went through the ditches, overflowed into the wells, and cloudy bubbles began to burst right on the surface, leaving behind the stench of a dead swamp. You couldn't drink it even with prayer, even with a filter, even if your throat was burning with thirst. I checked the light on myself. After the second sip, she vomited right into the snow. She lay there, trembling all over, and knew that winter had come. Real. No calendars, no news, no forecast. Only the icy stench of dampness and the cold that crept under the skin. The village was rotting. It wasn't just collapsing. It was rotting. From the inside. The logs in the huts were peeling, as if someone had boiled them in acid. For some, the huts sagged like exhausted lungs. There was no one on the roofs where the crows used to sit. No birds, no rats, not even a damn fly. It's all gone. There were only people left. Ilya was the first to notice this. One night he went outside and realized that not a single rustle was heard. No creaking of the trees, no dripping from the roofs. The world seemed to freeze, but not from fear, but from indifference, like a dead man who no longer expects to be found. Sveta's son was lying under a blanket, his eyes half open, and his breathing was shallow. He no longer needed anything, no food, no water. Just a warm hand and silence. Sveta sat next to him, stroked his head, sang something stupid. fragments of songs that used to be played in the kitchen when the soup was cooking. And it was raining outside the window. And there were windows. Her face was sagging. There were blue streaks under her eyes, and her hands were covered in cuts. She hadn't slept for 4 days. She was still trying to gather at least something to eat, at least some hope. I found a squashed goose in the garden. I brought it, boiled the broth. The son did not eat. He just turned away. Dima did not approach them anymore. He lived separately, in the gatehouse where the tools used to be stored. The boards were rotten, but the roof held. He was drawing diagrams on the walls, writing words with charcoal that no one understood. Next to him is his knife, wrapped in rags to keep it from ringing. After the attack, he stopped responding to other people's touch. Even when Sveta tried to hug him, he recoiled as if from fire. Only Ilya listened, and then in silence. Dima had a goal. No one knew what it was, but he was walking towards her. Every day he went somewhere, brought boards, fragments of old antennas, cable, pieces of plastic. He was collecting something of my own. Pashka. Pashka was no longer human. He lived in the school, or rather under it, in the basement where the archives used to be. His cabin was a realm of rot and chemicals. It smelled so bad that even the rats died. Sometimes there were thuds from there, muffled, as if someone was throwing bodies against the walls. One day Sveta tried to get down, but Ilya barely dragged her away. He said that it now has its own biosphere, that if Pashka makes medicines, it's only for himself, that no one goes in there anymore unless they want to come out as a couple. Then the stranger returned. He left, disappeared for 3 days. Everyone thought he wouldn't come back. And he returned into the night, quietly, like a shadow, sat down by the campfire, took out a can of stew and ate. He ate with his hands, greedily, without wiping his face. They didn't ask him where he had been. He didn't have a badge around his neck, just an old cut, as if someone had tried to skin him. He stared into the fire, and there was only one thing in his eyes: fatigue. The one beyond pain. The one that remains when everything else is already dead. The next day, Ilya said, "I got the signal. Not just a noise code. Old, military. They have started the rehabilitation. We have 12 days. Then, burning out." Sveta wasn't surprised. No tears, no screaming. She just clenched her fists. She said, "We have nowhere to go, so we'll stay. With my son." Pashka was laughing in the basement. His laughter sounded like the rumble of a meat grinder. He was shouting something like, "Everything's according to plan, bitches. All to ashes. All of them. I am alone. I will survive. I am the king of the swamp. I'm joining the team. I am an antiseptic." Ilya was getting ready. I collected a map, a sawn-off shotgun, and a rusty army flask with turpentine slurry instead of water. The stranger looked, got up, and followed him. Not a word, just footsteps. They went north towards the old part, where, according to Ilya, the control point remained. The old communications booth or the jammer, he didn't know. But if you destroy it, maybe the cleaning process will break down, even for a day. Dima wanted to go with them. Ilya stopped him with a look. He just said, "You're needed here. Someone has to stay." 2 days later, only the stranger returned. One, covered in blood, without a weapon, with a ragged piece of metal around his neck, probably Ilya's badge. He put it by the campfire, lay down next to it, and did not get up again. He was breathing, but he was silent, like a stone, like a foundation, like the last detail of the world that still holds in place. Sveta sewed her son into a burlap sack at night. He died quietly. Not a word. Not a sigh. Only the fingers moved slightly before the end, as if they wanted to show something. Or maybe he just dreamed in a dream that he was back on the grass, somewhere in the summer, with a candy in his mouth. She buried it against the wall, in the frozen ground. I hammered the nail from above so that no one would touch it. Dima then came up and left a splinter on the grave, on which was carved, "He was not a mistake." And everything. No one else said anything, because there was no point. Because everything that could be said died with that boy. With his cough, with his eyes, with his warmth. The world did not collapse. He just got a little quieter. The village was held by inertia, like a corpse that they forgot to tell it was time to rot. Sveta woke up at the same time every day, not because she wanted to, but because her brain could no longer sleep longer. She got up, pulled on her pants, washed her face with melted water, wiped her face with snow, because otherwise the skin would crack. Then she went to her son's grave, sat down next to him, and was silent. Sometimes she talked to him, not out loud, but her lips moved, about the past, about how he would have been the best reader at school, about how he and his father got lost on the lake one day, that she no longer feels any smells, hunger, or warmth, just the walls, from the inside. Dima spent more and more time alone. He finished sheathing the inside of the lodge. There were now lamps, batteries, pieces of mirrors on the walls, and above the door was carved in charcoal. The exterior is a lie. In the corner is a diary, covered from edge to edge with strange diagrams, words, and excerpts. Sometimes he dug. He said that it was necessary to strengthen the foundation. In fact, I was digging up wires, cable remnants, and looking for metal. He had a goal, but he didn't share it with anyone. Sveta tried. She approached, asked questions. He didn't make eye contact. He just nodded or left. An invisible barrier has grown between them, not out of spite, but out of survival. Everyone became separate. The community no longer existed. Pashka finally moved out. He hasn't been seen for 3 days. There were strange, unnatural sounds coming from the basement. The creaking of metal, the splashing of water, as if something big and wet was moving in the dark. Once, right in the middle of the night, a woman's voice was heard. Scream. Tall, ragged. Sveta grabbed the sawn-off shotgun and ran, but the door was boarded up from the inside. She was standing, hitting the butt, screaming. There was silence in response, only steam from the ventilation and drops falling from a rusty pipe. She returned home in shock, clutching the shotgun so that her knuckles turned white. The next morning the door was open. It's empty inside. Only there is a fresh inscription on the wall. I know how to revive. Sveta did not sleep after that. Her eyes became sharp, and her face was dry and streaked. She stopped feeling fear. Fear died with his son. Now there was only waiting. She put stakes around the school, drove pieces of rebar into the ground, and set traps. It wasn't a defense. This was the front line. The enemy wasn't specific, but she knew he would be. Soon. The stranger was lying in the gatehouse, motionless, alive. He was breathing. I rarely ate. He said never. He became a part of the village, its furniture, its last witness. Sometimes he just sat on the porch, looking into the woods. Sometimes he would leave for an hour. No one asked where. Sveta suspected that he was looking for traces of Ilya, or those who killed Ilya. Or he did it all himself. But there was nothing to prove, and there was no desire left. On the 6th day after Ilya left, something happened in the village that was feared, but not expected. 4 people came out of the forest. It's not noisy, without fuss, calmly, as if they knew where they were going. 2 in bulletproof vests, 1 with an axe, the 4th with a shovel. Everyone has respirators. We walked steadily, checked the houses. One of them laughed, opened the mailbox, and spat inside. Sveta saw them first. She wasn't waiting. She went out onto the porch, raised the sawed-off shotgun, and fired. Not into the air, right into the head of the one with the shovel. He fell, wheezed, and his face was cut open. The others froze at first, then returned fire. A real war has begun. Bullets pierced the rotten walls, splinters flew into the eyes, sparks from the campfire shot into the sky. Sveta was shooting without a break. Dima pulled out a slingshot from somewhere. Not a child's slingshot, but a military slingshot with metal balls. He shot one in the temple. Pashka came out at that moment, without clothes, with a canister and a burning rag. He shouted, "I'm the first! I'm the primary! I'm Alpha!" and threw a bottle at them. Flash. One of the aliens caught fire. He fell down and screamed. The others retreated. They're gone. Sveta was finished off by a wounded man with a shot in the back of the head. No regrets. After that, the village froze. Like after a blow. The silence became as thick as ice. Sveta sat down by the campfire, put her head in her hands, and did not cry. I just sat there. There was something definitive in her face. The next morning, each of the survivors had a wall inside. Impenetrable. Sveta didn't invite anyone else, either to her place or to school. Dima barricaded himself in. The stranger was gone. Pasha. They found him in the basement. He tied himself up. He hanged himself standing on a bucket. Under it is a puddle of pills and blood. There's a note on the wall. I was right. But not this time. Sveta burned down the school. Entirely. To hell with it. She stood with a torch, watching an old tree burn, the roof collapse, and the cans in the pantry explode. And she didn't leave until the flames had consumed everything. It was an act. Not revenge. Cleansing. Not the world. But yourself. That night, for the first time, the village was truly silent. No shots fired. Not a word. Just the pounding of his own heart and the walls. Inside. Outside. Everywhere. It was unusually bright in the morning. The sun scratched sluggishly through the clouds, as if trying to apologize for something that still exists. The smoke from the school went up into the sky like a black trail, like a mark, like a cry that someone else was holding on, or held on. Sveta was sitting on the rubble, looking at the ashes. My fingers are covered in blood. I cut my palm when I was dragging the boards. The skin cracked, but she didn't even feel it. Pain has become a foreign language. She no longer ate, slept, or prayed. I didn't expect anything. She just was. Like a pedestal. Dima went out at noon. He was covered in soot. His eyes were black and there was dirt under his fingernails. He was carrying a notebook. The fat one. Stitched together from scraps, newspapers, pill wrappers, and notebook pages. There are records inside. His diary. Smooth handwriting. He walked slowly, as if every step was a choice. He went up to the boy's grave, put down the notebook, and circled it with his hands. Not a word. Not a glance at the light. She didn't move. The stranger was found near the gatehouse. Is dead. He lay quietly, as if he had fallen asleep. Next to it is a badge, again on the neck, only now with the inscription scratched out with a needle. The object has been neutralized. There was something like relief on his face, or just exhaustion. He had nothing else. No bag, no guns, no past. Sveta buried him without a word, without the cross, just into the pit, next to the garbage pit, because the place no longer mattered. Now all the dots are the same. Nobody touched Pashka. He just hung there like an exhibit. The boards turned black, and the rope stretched out. Slugs were crawling out from under the floor. Black sludge dripped from the ceiling. His laboratory is still there. No one came in. No one answered. Let it be. Let him rot by himself. He was the last one who believed that anything could be changed. And he died in this faith. Stupid, painful, like an infected wound. On the third day, Sveta wrote an inscription at the entrance to the village. An old tank, in big letters. Don't come in. It's over. It wasn't a warning. It was a confession. She went into houses, collected leftovers, looked at old photos that no one had time to burn. She looked as if she was trying to remember what it was like to live. Do not go outside with a gun. Do not keep your son in a blanket, checking if he is breathing. Don't count the bullets and don't flinch at the sound of your own coughing. But it didn't work out. The photos made me want to vomit. They were lying. Dima disappeared. He just left. No sound. No goodbye. Just the prints in the snow. Sveta found his tracks near the swamp. Nothing further. Maybe he went to the river. Probably drowned. I may have reached it. But she didn't follow, because there was nothing to look for. That evening she sat by the campfire. I built a fire from the remains of the school, from the desks where someone once wrote love on a painted board. I warmed my hands, long, for a very long time. Then she stood up. I entered the school, in the ruins of which the old door to the basement still remained. She came down, back to where it all started, where Pashka's laboratory was left, where the sounds roamed, where it smelled of death. The door slammed shut. The click was distinct, the kind after which they don't come back. The next morning it was foggy, gray, viscous, heavy. Only one person came out of the village. Dima. Her face is pale, and there are purple shadows under her eyes. My hands are empty. The clothes are torn off. He didn't look back. He wasn't walking fast. I was just walking. He reached the boy's grave. Get up. I looked at it. He nodded. Then he went on, towards the swamp. In the direction where they said for a long time, there are old believers, or just silence. The notebook was left lying on the grave. There were words in it. On the last page there is an inscription. We were breathing. We wanted to live. It didn't help. There was no one else in the village. There was no cry, no prayer, not even a memory. Just the walls and water. It's heavy. The dark one. Past.